Good evening, everybody. I'm so pleased to see all of you here tonight for what's going to be a fantastic performance with the Orchestra, the Age of Enlightenment with Julia Bullock. It's something that we've been looking forward to for a very long time, and it is my distinct pleasure to be joined by Crispin Woodhead, the CEO of the Orchestra, the Age of Enlightenment, and Daniel Bates, the oboist, with the group. So please join me in welcoming them. I think the first question I have for you is that I'm curious how this particular project came together with Julia, and maybe just a little bit of a backstory about that, if you.
Okay, I'm very happy to start with that one. Well, there's an interesting story to this program. I don't know whether you know the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, but it's one of those ensembles that specializes in historically informed performance. Have you got your instrument now? See, Daniel has his oboe with us, you see, and you'll know immediately when he's got it out. It does not like the oboe that you might see in a symphony orchestra. There are all sorts of obvious differences just in the way it looks. And as that appears, I'll tell you a little bit more about this program. So we try to play using the instruments and the techniques and the scholarship and the custom and practice that would have been expected at the time. Now that journey of looking back and asking questions, it's all about asking questions. What did it sound like? How did you play it? Who wrote it? Why? Who for? All of those questions. If you think along those lines, you come to a bit of a brick wall at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 18th century, in the end of the 19th century, because you get into this fog, this darkness, where so much of the music that you know, that I know, we know, Handel, Mozart, Haydn, Bach, was an obscurity. Here's an example. We are residents at the South Bank Centre in London. That was built, the Royal Festival Hall was built in 1950, to celebrate the Festival of Britain. If you'd stood on the steps outside and hummed along with this tune, tam ba-da-dum ba-dum ba-dum bum bum dum bum dun dun, and I see some flashes of recognition straight away despite my awful singing. That's the Haydn Cello Concerto in C. Very famous, much loved, often played, always on the radio. It's a big hit in concert halls. People always turn up for it. No one would have known it because it was still hidden in a library in Prague and was only discovered 11 years later. That's what we're up against. And so this is a program not just about these popular pieces that we all know and like, and have handles like Juju, Joy of Man's Desiring. We're actually playing that one this evening, or Air on a G String. There's another one, Handel's Largo, or The Harmonious Blacksmith, or Arrival of the Queen of Sheba. How come these pieces have got these magic handles that connect us to them when they've really only been in our circulation for a relatively recent and brief period of time? That's quite a fundamental question if you're in the business of wanting to know why it was written, what it was written for, and who for, because there's part of that discovery process, which is, how on earth did we find out about this stuff in the first place? And next question, what about all the other stuff we don't know, which is just as good? So, with that said, he's assembled this instrument. Let's have a look at one.
Good evening. So this is a copy of an oboe made by Thomas Stainsby Sr. in London in sort of 18th century, turn of the 18th century. It's a copy because sadly not many instruments of this age survive in playing condition because we put them under quite a lot of stress, unfortunately, with the kind of volume of air and the condensation that goes down them, so the bore's forever kind of expanding and contracting. So there's an example. This one is a copy of an oboe that exists in a museum in Japan, and it's made by a very good friend of mine. He's a genius oboe maker called Pau Oriols, who lives in Catalonia. He's Catalan and very fiercely proud of his heritage. And actually, there's an interesting kind of history of the wind band, the outdoor wind band instruments of Catalonia. That he started making those first, these kind of very shrill that are played like that. I mean, it's an awful sound, but it's also utterly brilliant, and like really embedded in the culture there. So he kind of expanded his remit. I've actually just been delivered. There's an awful long waiting list for these instruments, by the way. I mean, they look quite simple, and they're probably not horrendously complicated to make, but because there are only kind of 2 or 3 really excellent makers in the world, I was waiting 4 years for this, from paying the deposit to being delivered. And during that time, hilariously, Pao very kindly provided me with what he calls an oboe de basura, which means an oboe, a trash oboe or a rubbish oboe, which I still own and actually really love, because I was playing it for 4 years and I bonded with it. But this one is actually better. But yeah, I'm very lucky to have it, and I sort of love playing it. And it's nice to think of that it's got, its actual ancestor is being kind of cared for in a museum in Japan. There are other Stainsby instruments. There's a recorder in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I don't think there are any other Stainsbys in this country in museums, any other, not oboes anyway. There is a tenor oboe in the Horniman Museum, which is very near from where I come from, in South East London. But yeah, just to say, I'm actually one of you guys. I live in DC now. I've been here for 2 years, and I'm studying for a doctorate at Stony Brook University. And my professor Erica Honish is actually here at the back, and she's an utter expert on all things Renaissance, or Renaissance, as she would say, and Baroque, or Baroque, as she would say. So it's I'm really delighted that she's here. And actually, if we get anything too technical to answer, I'm just going to turn and look at her. So I'm delighted that she's here.
Well, thank you. No, it's one of the things that I think it's important for people to realize about some of these earlier instruments is how difficult they are to play compared in different ways compared to some modern instruments. And I just looking at the repertoire that you typically play, there must have been some really killer oboists at the time that were available to Bach and these other players. And I don't know if you have any insight into that, but is it something where things like circular breathing and whatnot were kind of something that was expected, or did people just simply work with what within the realms of the?
I mean, as far as I know, and I think as far as we know, circular breathing on the oboe is a relatively modern invention.
Okay.
In fact, I play a lot of modern oboe as well, and specifically Americans seem to use it a lot more than we Europeans do. Nothing wrong with it, and they make it work very, very well. But yeah, I mean, it's breath-wise, breath control, these instruments are slightly easier than the modern oboe because of the kind of the width of the bore. The modern oboe is more effortful normally to play. This one, it's sort of, I mean, it's not easy, don't get me wrong, but it feels more like singing in a way. So you do break phrases when you have to, and I hope that Bach would approve, even though these some of the phrases go on for hours,
yeah.
Until we're literally red in the face. But I think there's something about the style of Baroque music which is slightly, I don't want to say informal, but the way that composers of the day scored the music, for instance, would be, this is the violin one part, oboe, you play as much of it as you possibly can. And so I think there's sort of there's more leeway in music of this period than there is certainly in 19th century, 20th century music, where what you play is really, it's kind of very prescribed and very exacting.
Great answer.
But you are right that there's a whole different world of technicality that you can observe from where you're sitting. You can see the different material of the instruments, and you can also see some implications about how instruments work, the way people are situated, the distribution of players around the stage, the number of players that you have. An obvious point, you might hear a big symphony orchestra play Brandenburg 3, but actually the way we'll do it is there'll be 3 violins, there'll be 3 violas, there'll be 3 cellos, there'll be a double bass, and there'll be a continuo instrument or 2. And that's it. And that's the proportion, and that's the balance. And in the other concerti, the Brandenburg concerti, you would need to respect that, because otherwise you'd find an imbalance between the instruments. But you're asking about technique. Look at the bow hold. Look at the bows. Look at the difference. If you know a bow, modern bow is braced on either side. Look at the way these taper. And from that, you might think, that's why a Baroque phrase will always do this, because the bow gets lighter. True up to a point, except And I'm right on this, I'm sure, Dan. Well, he'll correct me. He'll jump in and there's a rearguard action just waiting. But it was actually written down in treatises to acknowledge that there was that inherent inclination of the bow towards it, if you like, a diminuendo. So you practice against it. So you need to sustain the sound and keep it steady. You do, and you increase pressure as you go along. So there are all sorts of different technical mindsets around the orchestra. You can see it with the players at the keyboard. You know, the use of the thumb is a controversial matter for harpsichordists and organists, you know. Before I was a musician, I was an organist, and that works on both sides of the pond, that joke. It's a cracker. I'm so glad I got to tell that joke in America. That's just brilliant. Anyway, but it's more than a joke, because there are these rather sort of curious early 20th century editions of Bach where they'll put a little cross for the thumb. And I remember learning a big chorale prelude, and someone who knew an awful lot more about playing Bach and authentic performance practice than I did at the time, saying, it was Scotch, who said, "What are you doing that for?" And just put a red line through it. And simple fact is, you know that there was a different kind of technique because of the way phrases were written. It's obvious. The music will tell you, just in the way that what is expected is written out. But then there are other implications. You see pictures. So you can see a lot about the technique just by looking at the bow hold. And we're unfortunately not going to be graced by the presence of David Plylar, our principal trumpet. See, he literally fell down a hole in San Francisco and has been in Zuckerberg Hospital. But we have a guest star substitute, which is a thing that they would do. You know, they could, because the high clarino trumpet is rather like this amazing sound. So they weirdly, they are sort of sonic bedfellows. Anyway, you would see immediately that that's all perspiration, lip, and I don't know what, supernatural prowess. If you see the horn players, and you look carefully, you'll see, because they can't depend upon the valves, they do this weird thing of changing the shape of their hand as they change their embouchure, effectively to sort of simulate a slightly different pipe length as they fashion a bit more bell or a bit less, and that gives them the extra notes. So they learn this whole semaphore. I don't know how to do it. They're all nuts. They need very careful management, mostly a good tie. And you can see that going on. And these are all the sort of colors and varieties of instrumental practice that got normalized along with editions and standardization and publication, which is a much later thing, which of course brings me back to the point I made of this period of obscurity where there wasn't a coordinated distribution and manufacturing industry reconciling everything to equivalent standards. Things just went in shoeboxes and people picked up different instruments and played them, possibly even at a different pitch. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, there's a lot there, but I kind of want to go back to something you said earlier when you were also talking about choice of repertoire, because that's, I mean, you'd mentioned that there's, you know, the question of why is it that certain things become canonical or part of the even the more of a public awareness in a way that lots of classical music doesn't make it. And how did that? What was behind the choice to say we're going to choose a number of those particular pieces for this program? I know that you of course play lots of very different things. But what kind of led to that? Is this like a chance to have a fresh take on things that we think we know? Or
I've had a nod. I'll start, but then you'll want to hear from him. Well, actually, there are a couple of points here. First of all, there's a peculiar kind of inversion with classical music. I use the word classical in a very broad sense. That in a way, the more popular and more loved it is, the sort of lower down it goes in the scale of connoisseurism and prestige, which is entirely the opposite for so many other genres of music. So that's a bit of a problem because, of course, we play Handel's Saul at Glyndebourne and we'll do complete Rameau operas and we'll play those Haydn symphonies that you really ought to hear more and don't. Of course, we do all of those things. And we are part of that commitment to establishing familiarity with all that repertoire that still remains in the darkness, and there's plenty of it. But I had a conversation with one of the big, really marvelous colleague who was a promoter in the regions outside London, in Great Britain, And he ran a number of big venues. And he said, you know those tunes like Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring and, you know, there's Four Seasons and things. And I said, yes. He said, no one ever plays them. Actually, no one ever plays them because they say, oh, we're not playing those old chestnuts. And so actually, no one ever comes to Nottingham or Cardiff or Birmingham and plays them well. So why don't you? And then when we started looking at the program, we thought, oh, there's so much more to all of this. Like, you could think, I've been kept on the phone waiting, listening to Pachelbel's Canon and Jig. I've heard it enough. But it's a work of genius. It's a work of genius. And I defy anyone to really convince me that repetition of a work of genius diminishes it. So, Dan, how do you feel? Because listen. I'm just the guy who sits behind the computer. This is the person who actually plays. What does it feel like from your point of view? Do you feel that when you play, you're there playing A Ride with the Queen of Sheba? Do you feel chestnutty?
Slightly, but I think one thing that this orchestra is good at is letting people bring their own personalities to the music. And I think, especially in Baroque and classical music as well, it's to be encouraged to put our own stamp on it. I mean, honestly, when playing these instruments, sometimes it's so hard what we're doing, and under extreme circumstances, that you just you have no idea what's going to come out the end of your instrument. So, in a way, that's quite freeing. So you think, well, let's be as musical and as passionate about it as we can, because it's inevitably something's going to go slightly wrong, or there's going to be a squeak, or something's going to happen. And there's something quite nice about that if you start from that position of everyone kind of accepting that that's on the cards. It's quite liberating.
Sure. No, that's really interesting. That's great. That's a great attitude, I think, to have. So to just go in and just make it happen. This is a very interesting conversation, and I think that you're right that we don't get to hear these things in person much at all. But there's also things on this program that I'm almost certain there's something new for everybody. I mean, you know what I mean?
This is a really important point. You see, it's our call to action. The reason that I would argue that most of these pieces, that they have got to the status of being chestnut status. That's a pretty good thing. I mean, it would be going platinum if you're Elton John, but it's chestnut status if you're Bach. They're brilliant. That's the first thing. They're just brilliant. They're works of unalloyed brilliance. Imagine having a blank piece of paper in front of you, and at the end of it, you've produced the Symphonia to the beginning of that act in Solomon. And then the minute anybody hears it, they remember it forever. And everybody wants it at their wedding. That's quite an achievement, right? That's the first thing. But, one of those amazing statistics, which really doesn't say anything about anybody, but it just interests. One of the top-selling, if not the top-selling album in the United States is the Eagles' Greatest Hits. Now, we have exactly a similar... Robbie Williams has now achieved as many number one hits as Ringo Starr, and I think he's all the rest of them. So there you go. And it would be fair to assume that more people, for example, in Great Britain, know tunes by Robbie Williams than they do from 150 years of some of the most extraordinary musical talent working on similar lines of ambition that there's ever been. Isn't that remarkable? And it makes me think, my goodness me, these bright spots of light. And of course, there's Solomon, and you should hear Solomon if you haven't. And there are all these great works, larger works, and sets from which they've come. But there's an enormous amount that's been forgotten, and that we know these works, by the way, by accident. It's Dame Myra Hess playing Jesu Joy, and then eventually we become acquainted with Herz und Mund und Tat und Leben. Say that if you've had a few drinks. And then there's... Actually, I can't. And then there's those sort of curious, extraordinary discoveries that you realize, yeah, it was a man's world. Men were educated, women tend to be sidelined. Patronage favored men. The church, certainly, if you're in the church in Rome in the 17th century, you wouldn't have a church music job. You certainly wouldn't get a job as a Kapellmeister as a woman. Nevertheless, you have Barbara Strozzi somehow making it through. You have Jacques de la Guerre in the court of Louis the 14th, protégé of Lully, producing an opera that you may, I mean, don't quote me on this, but you may hear a little bit of it tonight, from 1694. That's kind of amazing, isn't it? So can we overcome the accidental connections system that we have with all this repertoire? Can we get through that fog and become more acquainted with this wonderful period of music, listen to more and discover more things we can't sort of get out of our eardrums once we've heard them? That's kind of the point here, I think. I'm looking at you now, Dan.
I agree.
Don't just say you agree. No, never say that you agree with the chief executive. That's a very bad move. You know this. But in a way, seems like an obvious opportunity. You know, you've been asking questions. Does anybody have questions of us here? You know, of the way we play, the reason we play it, and the point about engagement. Of course, there's another point to this, and that is that if we go to underserved areas in the United Kingdom, for example, and we play them lovely tunes, then they'll come back. they'll want to hear more, and if they want to hear more, they'll say, "Well, can I hear the other Brandenburgs, please?" Or, "We'd like to hear all of Solomon." That is what success looks like, in my humble opinion. Anyhow.
Please, if you do have questions, just wait for a microphone. Just raise your hand, and my colleague will bring a microphone over.
How did you come to play? How did Sandra Bullock come to play with you?
That's such a good question. Well, I saw her singing Theodora at the Royal Opera House, and that was about the same sort of time that we had this program. We originally called it Baroque Busters, but that would be lost on you because it's based on a TV program called Blockbusters that we watched when we were kids, and there was a massive hit. And so it would be a lead balloon. So it was refashioned as going for Baroque. No, and then we thought, no, that won't work. So it's the golden age of Baroque. And we were presenting that to our friends around the United States where we've performed or who have an interest in what we might be doing. And I think it was a conversation at Cal Performances in Berkeley, where Julia is a resident artist, and they said, "Well, hang on a minute, why don't you work together?" And so we spoke to Julia, and she looked at the repertoire and suggested some things she'd like to do. And so that just put, if you like, I mean, it's not right to describe her as a cherry, but it was like a cherry on the cake. It just completed a picture that I think that made a lot of sense to people, and it's been very interesting.
Let's go ahead.
One of the challenges of having this rotational leadership, I think, it's 4 people that you rotate around, and
that's definitely a question for Dan.
Okay.
Yes, but our 4 leaders, yes, and four instrumental leaders, yes, 4 lead violinists.
I mean, I don't see any challenges. I only see positives, really, because it's for the same reason. Well, perhaps for the same reason that we don't have a principal conductor. We don't have someone in charge of the orchestra. And of course, they have strong voices, all 4 of them, and they lead in different ways, and they bring different things to the orchestra. But it keeps everything really fresh. And they all, they have kind of their strengths, the kind of repertoire that they prefer to do. But it's what I really enjoy is when, sometimes you see all 4 of them playing together, and there'll be the 2 leaders on leading the first and the second, or working collaboratively like that. And I think that's a really positive thing for the orchestra, that they're strong personalities, but they can all collaborate together and work together. It's really nice.
Yeah, there's a question over there, which just a tailpiece to that, and that is that the OEE was formed very much as not quite as an act of mutiny, but very nearly, because there's this idea that you can't have the orchestra without the conductor. And to cut a story short and to crudely simplify it, there was going to be a concert, and the conductor said, "Oh, I can't really do it," and the player said, "Well, we're doing it anyway," and they presented the concert without the conductor. And I think that's a really important psyche of the orchestra. It's a really important perspective on the psyche that, there are, if you ask them who's Spartacus, they all stand up, "I'm Spartacus." Another one said, "I'm Spartacus." You have 4 leaders, but actually Dan could quite easily lead a project, and if Dan's playing as a soloist, then that would be naturally the logic of it. And so this sort of shared intellect and shared ambition, from my point of view, it's great because I can just sit and watch them and they make all the decisions, and I can just dress up in a suit. So there are lots of perks. There was a question over there.
You did a nice job of explaining some of the reasons why women's music didn't, I can't remember the phrase you used, but didn't break through.
Mm-hmm.
More recently, though, it's also because of the male gatekeepers who decide what to play now, not just what was produced back then and all the obstacles women face, but also the many men and even women who don't believe that there was any music written by women that was worthwhile. So congratulations that you are allowing Barbara Strozzi to break through. What brought you, given that there are many musicians and even organists who don't recognize, you didn't laugh.
So I was so
I gotcha.
you did get me.
But there are many musicians who can't even name a woman composer after going
Yeah,
through
I know.
music conservatories.
Yeah.
And so how did you discover Barbara Strozzi, and how do you recommend that others become aware of the music by women such as her and Jacques Delac?
Well, Dan, are you okay? One of the privileges of being in my position is that, because you see, the thing is that you heard from Dan. I mean, Dan is a sort of a typical example of the membership of the OE, in that they're always in scholarship. Everybody has a paper in them, or has written one, or is a professor in some way, and so that kind of it's a genuine and unprejudiced attitude to just wanting to find out more, and so there is a natural circulation about figures who have been neglected, and also an interrogation of why. A case in point, if you were a very talented female musician, say in the early 19th century, the chances are you'd still be sidelined. The access to the symphony orchestra, its proportions, the concert promotion, you just wouldn't be considered. And so for someone like Fanny Mendelssohn, getting into that, it would be Felix. So all the discussion would be Felix. Even if you had the ability to write as well, differently maybe, but to be able to be a completely convincing artistic voice. So there's a kind of amanuensis role, and you're absolutely right. The people who take on that have to be sympathetic, and they have to be interested. And I think it's all I can say is that it's a facet of the way in which the orchestra thinks, that it's quite disruptive. It's a facet of being historically informed, that you sort of don't think, well, it goes like this. You say, well, how does it go? And I think you pretty much ask that every time you play, actually, watching you. You will say, well, are you sure we're doing it right? Does it go at this speed? And so it follows. If you've got that kind of curiosity, you'll ask it about anything. So you'll say, well, if Fanny Mendelssohn wrote all this brilliant chamber music, what would it sound like if it were orchestrated? And so a step might be, well, she's not here, but maybe we can get contemporary female composers to orchestrate and give a perspective. At least then you can hear it side by side. So I think the answer is, it's just asking questions. It's a mindset of scholarship. It's people like Dan, who Dan is I'm going to be very flattering now, but Dan is a completely extraordinary player in that he's a fantastic modern player, but has this amazing gift as a period player, and he could quite happily just coast along doing really well and playing all sorts of amazing things and curating festivals and not really bother. But actually he's studying, and I think that's the point. And I think it's from that sort of, in a way, that position of innocence and inquiry that you get to something positive, like including a really great number like Che si può fare by Strozzi. It's great, it's brilliant. There you go.
Thank you for that answer. I think we have another one. Here we go.
Mention of scholarship made me curious. How have you and your group tried to evince or create greater interest in terms of education for Baroque music? And not only by performing it and getting people excited by hearing it, but actually teaching it in schools or making it part of a curriculum in conservatories and trying to emphasize it.
I think this is very much one for you. I'm
Oh,
sorry,
Dan, this
Crispin,
is just-
but this is your jam. This is
No, I don't know. No. Look, the thing is, we have charismatic people like this, so that's really important. So, you have to be able to make the sound and do the thing, or else why would a young person want to engage with that? There are a whole lot of myths about, young people and whether or not they like classical music. They probably find certain things off-putting which have got nothing at all to do with the music you're talking about, but the context in which it's performed or the approach that is taken. But the actual material itself, that's not usually a problem. We do have an education program, and we always have had, and we tour and we do all sorts of things. But 4 or 5 years ago, we decided we'd take a step and do something different. And actually, we're the first organisation in the United Kingdom to do it. And what we've done is we've moved into a state comprehensive school. So that's children from the ages of 11 to 18 in North London. 50% of them can't afford free school meals. It's 30% black and minority ethnic. It's 25 to 27% special educational need. And our offices, my office is in the playground. We rehearse in the school hall, and we have a whole engagement program with the community and with young people there. And that has all kinds of amazing offshoots. And we got not enough time to explain and for Dan to speak about what he does in that program, because he's a really significant part, as all the players are. But one spin-off is they like dancing at the school. That was something to hold on to. So at the end of an unusual conversation, but a successful one, they're dancing hip-hop to our Bach, and we're taking that to international festivals. And we'd love to bring it here. But that's literally teenagers memorizing the double concerto, 2 violins, D minor, to this amazing choreographer with a great distinguished choreographer, and that's good enough to put on the main stage in Covent Garden. So that kind of thing is the seeing is believing thing you've just got to do, and you can only do it if you're there all the time, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. Any other questions that we'd like to from the audience? I guess, I mean, that you stole my question. Was I was going to ask about, I know you had these amazing programs that you do with educational programs, but maybe we'll let you go and get ready for the concert here shortly, but we'd love to hear a bit about kind of what's coming up for you, if you have any new projects that you're going to be pursuing in the coming season, or anything you'd be willing to share with us about that.
Well, there's a lot of exciting stuff coming up. I mean, Crispin was talking about a project we're doing in March, I believe, which is Das Jahr, right? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of reimagined. You sort of alluded to it. So it's reimagining some of Fanny Mendelssohn's compositions for orchestra, and commissioning some of the leading female composers in our country to write companion pieces. I'm right, aren't I?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you have the piano cycle and then the orchestration. And
it's been lovely working in, not exactly collaboration, but these composers have sent us their scores, and they're like, well, is this possible on an oboe of this period? And it's sort of nice to be involved in this conversation, and how far you can push the techniques, and even extended techniques, which aren't generally called for on an instrument like this. Then in the summer we're premiering a new production of Marriage of Figaro, which sadly I'm not doing, and I'm really sad about it. And then we've got next year coming up is the anniversary year, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't quite know exactly what we're playing, but you will know more of the kind of tentpole event. So I'm going to hand over to you again, Crispin. Now.
Well, of course, as Dan's explained, we have our season at South Bank, which tours, and this is part of that. And we have our operas at Glyndebourne, but yes, it's 40 years at the OE. So we're a relatively young orchestra, but 40 years for us, we're like dog years. So that's like, in symphony orchestras, that's about 400. So, we're venerable. That's got some quite big things in it. We are doing Solomon, for example, and we've got a big program with Simon Rattle doing Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. That's a cracker. We've got the Creation, Haydn Creation, with this amazing firebrand called Václav Lux, who's the most incredible interpreter. So a whole program of rather remarkable things where we, a bit like Avengers Assemble, even though we're all Spartacus, we do have guest conductors like Adam Fischer and Ivan Fischer and Vladimir Yurovsky, and they are coming back, and they're working with us across 2 seasons. Vladimir Yurovsky is going to do The Rite of Spring. That's terrifying, isn't it?
That is great. I'm really excited about that.
On old plumbing and gut strings. That's a killer. No player assist mechanisms there. It's just all talent. But so lots of really exciting things like that. And with the school, who knows, all sorts of new projects that pop up at a different rate.
It's actually, I've just got to like flatter Crispin a little bit because I find it really inspiring the way that he encourages and envelops the kids into his orbit. And you sort of turn up. I remember turning up one day for rehearsal. We were doing a Gilbert and Sullivan opera, and there's Crispin doing arts and crafts outdoor, making all the costumes with the kids, and it's totally delightful.
That's very sweet. They did make very convincing suits of armor. You can see them online. It was really good. And the other thing is that if you've got, this is awful because I'm saying this in the Library of Congress and I'm being filmed, and it's a terrible thing to say, but if you really inspire a whole bunch of kids and they love what they're doing and they drink the Kool-Aid, that's what you'd say, then they work really hard and they cost nothing. Well,
On that note,
But it costs a lot of your effort and a lot of your positivity.
you had us there till the end.
I know, I'm so sorry. Who was that guy? Get him out of here.
Well, please join me in thanking our guests. We really appreciate you speaking with us.